In 1519, Hernán Cortés stepped into Tenochtitlan, the beating heart of the Aztec Empire, and froze. Before him rose a city unlike anything he had imagined. An island metropolis of 200,000 souls, shimmering atop a vast lake. Canals cut through its streets like veins of silver. Fresh water coursed through clay pipes. On Thelic's surface, gardens swayed and bloomed, feeding thousands. And above it all rose temples and towers, stark white against the sky. Cortés had seen Havana, he had seen Seville, but nothing on earth prepared him for this. Before we begin tonight's story, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps other sleepy souls find this content. And let us know in the comments which historical figure you'd like us to cover next. Now. The Aztecs had built something extraordinary in the Valley of Mexico. Just 200 years earlier, they had been anybody. Wanderers from the north, mercenaries who fought other people's. The established cities of Seville barely tolerated them. They were given the worst land available, a swampy land covered in snakes and mosquitoes from that miserable island. They built an empire by the time Cortés arrived. They ruled from the Atlantic to the Pacific. How did outcasts become emperors? How did a swamp become the center of The answer lies not in destiny or prophecy, but in a series of brilliant apoctations, ruthless alliances, and the simple refusal to accept the place the world had assigned them. Tonight, we'll walk through their great markets, where you could buy everything from jaguar pelts to holy mushrooms. We'll climb pyramids so steep that priests had to lean forward in submission to the gods. We'll witness both the glory of their flowering and the devastation of their fall. Not to superior technology or tactics, but tortoises their bodies had never encountered, and alliances they never saw coming. This is the story of the Aztec Empire. Chapter 1. The trail from the caves. The year was 1299. And Shieldflower knew she was going toady. She had known it for weeks now. Ever since her father's foolish rebellion had collapsed like wet clay in summer rain. The other tribes had crushed them completely. Now she stood in the great plaza of watching the priests prepare the sacrificial fire while the crowd precedent, eager for the spectacle. Her people call her Kimmel socket. For generations to come, they will remember this moment, not because she lived, but because she chose to die. Shieldflower's tribe had wandered south from the arid lands for 3 generations. Following game and searching for water, they were among the last 2. Arrive in the fertile basin of central Mexico where the good land had already been claimed. The earlier tribes looked at these newcomers with suspicion. Here came the band of Chicha, the dog people, armed with bows and arrows, speaking a dialect of natal that marked them a suit. The established cities needed soldiers, though they hired Shieldflower's people as mercenaries. For 2 generations, her tribe fought other people's wars. Her father, Hitzel, had grown tired of this arrangement. He declared independence from their employers. It was a miscalculation that would cost him everything. The Confederation of Cities, led by King Coxgrisht, the rebellion in a single. They killed most of the men. They took the women and children as slaves. Flower was brought to Calwacan to serve as a concubine. Instead, she demanded death. As the flames rose around her, she cried out to her enemies, "People of Calwacan, I go to where my god lives. My people's descendants will become great warriors. You will see Mexica." As Shieldflower's people called themselves, would tell this story for centuries. They would tell it when they built their first temple on a swampy island nobody else wanted. They would tell it when they forged their triple alliance. They would tell it when they ruled an empire that stretched from Zia to Sea. To understand the Mexica people who we know today as the Aztecs, you need to understand where they came from, not the myths about emerging from 7 caves, though they told those stories too. Their whole history starts with people walking, thousands of years of walking. The ancestors of all indigenous Americans crossed the Bering Land Bridge 20,000 years ago. They spread south through the continents in waves. Some settled early, others kept moving. Lifetime farming developed in central Mexico around 3,000 years before Shieldflower's death. The pattern was set. Thefamus claimed the best land. The hunters kept to the margins. The Aztecs belonged to this last group, while themes were carving colossal headsand. The people of Teotihuacan were building pyramids that touched the ancestors of the Aztecs were still following deer through Tenochtitlan deserts. They gathered prickleppear and they hunted rabbits with throwing sticks. Something changed around the year 100, the bow and arrow arrived from the north. This new weapon gave the nomadic groups an advantage they had never possessed. They could strike from a distance. They could pierce the cotton armor worn by the settled peoples. The migration south accelerated. These chicha came in waves. The Aztecs were among the last. By the time they edged the Valley of Mexico in the mid-1200s, every decent piece of land had been. The established states controlled the lake shores and fertile plains. The Aztecs found work where they could. They fished in fecholos. They collected salt. They fought as mercenaries. The ruins of older civilizations sought them. Teotihuacan had been abandoned for 500 years, but its pyramids still dominated the valley. The Aztecs walked among these ruins with awe. They believed this was where the gods had gathered to create the 5th sun, the current age of the world. A god named Nanaatsan had thrown himself into a fire here, they said, and emerged as the sun itself. The Aztecs were not unique in claiming descent from ancient glory. Every people lined the valley told stories connecting Tumsvols to the Toltecs or the Teotihuacanos. But the Aztecs had something the other had lost. They remembered what it meant to have nothing. They remembered Shieldflower's defiance. This memory shaped everything that when they finally built their city, they chose the worst land available, a marshy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. When they designed their society, they made room for advancement through military service. A commoner who captured 4 enemies could become a noble. A slave's son could reset or lead armies. They never forgot they were outside us. We had fought their way in. This knowledge made them hungry. It made them It made them ruthless. Within 200 years of Shieldflower's death, her descendants would rule the Aztec Empire in the history of Mesoamerica. People of Culhuacan. She had said, "You will see." Chapter 2. A city born of swamp and strategy, the island nobody wanted became the center of an empire. In 1325, the Aztecs laid the first stones of Tenochtitlan on a patch of swamp in Lake Texcoco. 50 years later, they controlled the valley. A 100 years Latvi ruled from coast to coast. This transformation began with a man born to a slave woman. His name, Vasitscoatl. His father was Acamapiqui, the first king of the Aztecs, but his mother came from another city taken inward. In the world of Aztec politics, this made its coatl useful for negotiations, but useless for succession. His half-brothers, born tenable wives, would inherit. He would serve the early decades on the island of Aztecs to make something. They built floating garden sculptures, rectangles of mud and vegetation anchored between poles, driven into the lake bed. They harvested fish, frogs, and salamanders. They collected agave from the water's surface and pressed it into cakes that tasted like cheese. While its guatel served his royal brothers, he watched the political landscape shift around them. The Valaers, dominated by Ashkapet Salo, ruled by an ancient king named Sumok. This king played the smaller cities against each other, taking tribute from all, favoring none for long. The Aztecs paid their share in fish and labor in 1426. Desamok died at the age of 106. His sons immediately went to war over succession. The valley erupted. Cities that had waited decades for revenge chose sides. Others tried to stay neutral and were destroyed anyway. Its Cortal saw an opportunity. He forged an alliance with Nezahualcóyotl, an exiled prince from Texaco, whose father had been murdered by Together with the city of Tlacopan, they formed what would become the Triple Alliance. 3 cities against the might of Azcapotzalp. The war lasted 2 years. When Azcapotzalp fell, its Catal did something next. He ordered every historical document in Tenochtitlan burned. Every scroll that suggested the Aztecs were destined to remain fishermen and mercenaries went into the flames. Every genealogy that favored his half-brother's children over his own turned to ash. The old painted histories that led readers to expect a future different from the one he had in mind were tossed into a bonfire as a sacrifice to Thegods. History would begin again with its Scotal as its author. From the ashes of the old books, new stories emerged. The Aztecs had always been destined for greatness. Their patron, Godshad, promised them an empire. The eagle eating a snake on a cactus. The synth that marked where they should build their city became the symbol of divine favor rather than desperate necessity. Its Gotal ruled for 13 years. Hetrans formed Tenochtitlan from a cluster of reed huts to a city of stone. He established the tribute system that willed fuel the empire's growth. When headed, the succession went not to thessons of his legitimate brothers, but Tohei's own chosen heir. The slave woman's son had rewritten the rules. Chapter 3. The Emperor's Game of Thrones. Every Aztec king had dozens of children be different wives. This was strategy, not excess. A wife from Texcoco secured that alliance. A wife from Texcarola might prevent war. But these arrangements created a court where half-brothers circled each other. Like jaguars, each backed by their mother's family, each believing they deserved the throne. In 1517, this system destroyed a poet, Named Hesetin Katzin. He was the son of Pili, king of Texcoco, born Toa, secondary wife from a minor nobler family. His talent with words had made him famous throughout the valley. His political sense would get him killed. The trouble started with a woman. She worked in the royal household, not nobility herself, but gifted with language. She and Hesetin Katzin composed songs together. They performed them at palace gatherings. In another world, this might have been merely scandalous. In Texcoco, it became treason. Moctezuma, the younger emperor of Tenochtitlan, wanted his own nephew, Instaladus, the next king of Tex. Coco.Quzods, singing Katzin stood in the way. The poet was too popular, too charismatic. His songs moved people. Moctezuma needed him, gone. The emperor sent messages to Nezahualcóyotl. He claimed there would be murder if the nobility were allowed to flout the laws. He insisted that Thecard be tightened around Hezotin Katzinchan's neck. The charge was adultery, though everyone knew the real crime was being the wrong son at the wrong time. Nezawalpili faced an impossible choice: refuse Mukuma and risk war between the Triple Alliance cities, execute his son and maintain the peace. He chose the empire over his child. The poet was strangled in the Palasa courtyard. His songs were banned. The woman who sang with him disappeared. This was how the Aztec elite maintained power, not through simple inheritance, but through constant negotiation and occasional murder. Every prince knew that his brothers might kill him. Every king knew that his allies were also his rivals. The system worked because Orion understood the rules. The palace complexes reflected these divisions. Each wife had her own household, her own servants, her own courtyard. The children grew up in separate worlds within the same walls. They met at ceremonies and feasts, sizing each other up, learning who had their father's favor. This season, succession came down to more than blood. It required political backing, and the ability to survive long enough to claim power. Many princes did in battle, sent on impossible missions be fathers who needed to thin the field. Others fell to poison or accident. The strongest and cleverest survived. The women navigated their own parallel compassion. A mother whose son became king secured wealth and influence for her entire family. A mother whose son died trying might find herself and her daughters married off to provincial nobles. Exiled from the center of power, Hexit Singh Katsan's death sent a message through every noble household in the empire. Art, love, and personal happiness meant nothing against political necessity. The Game of Thrones had no room for sentiment. The cord round the poet's neck reminded every owner that in the Aztec court, you played towing or you died. Chapter 4: A City of Marble and Mist. By 1519, Tenochtitlan held 200,000 souls. Venice had half that number. Paris slightly more. But no European city could match what the Aztecs had built on Dia Lake. Canals ran between the buildings like arteries. Fresh water flowed through clay pipes from springs. 3 miles away, human waste was collected in boats every morning and sold to farmers. The city was divided into 4 districts, each split into smaller neighborhoods called Kalpuli. Every Kalpuli had its own temple, its own marketplace. Families lived in single-story house built around courtyards. The wealthy faced their walls with volcanic stone. The poor made do with adobe. Women ran these households. They were the heart of the home. The Aztecs said their grinding stones, looms, and cooking pots were arranged with the same precision that priests used to organize temple offerings. A woman's broom was sacred. To step over it brought terrible luck. The main market at Tlailco drew 60,000 people on major market days. Merchants displayed their goods in designated sections. Gold workers here, feather workers there, cacao beans for currency, Thoth authorities. Constantly battled counterfeits who made fake beans from amaranth dough. You could buy anything: live eagles, jaguar pelts, turquoise from the distant north, shells from both oceans, prepared food for those in a hurry. Tamales dropped in corn husks, turkey stew thickened with ground pumpkin seeds, a drink made from and chili that only nobles were supposed to consume. Thalmachance found ways around that rule. The causeway connecting the island Toth mainland stretched 3 miles. 8 men could ride across it side by side. Wooden bridges could be removed to defend against attack. On normal days, the causeway carried endless lines, officers bent under their loads. Since Aztecs had no wheeled vehicles and no beasts of burden, at the city's heart stood the sapwood precinct. a walled compound containing 78 buildings. The great temple rose 150 feet into the sky, its twin shrines dedicated to the rain god, Kla, and the war god Willoughby. The stairs were deliberately steep. Priests and victims alike had to lean forward as they climbed, showing exhibition to the gods. The skull rack beside the temple displayed thousands of heads from sacrificial victims. They were arranged in neat rows, replaced as they decayed. Foreign ambassadors were always brought to see it. The message was clear. This is what we do to enemies. This is Thepawa that maintains the cosmic order. Every morning before dawn, priests blew conch shells from the temple tops. The sound carried across the lake, waking the city. Farmers pulled their canoes to the floating gardens. Merchants prepared their stalls. Warriors reported for training. Children walked to school, where they learned to recite the histories that Itzcoatl had approved. This was the city at its height. Organized, prosperous, terrifying. A place where urine was too valuable. Tuwast and human hearts kept the sun moving across the sky. Where everything had its place, and Avirian knew the rules. Where a Swamfad had become the center of the world. Chapter 5. The first glimpse of strangers. The messengers reached Moctezuma at dawn. They had run through the night from the coast, switching runners every few miles. Strange boats had appeared on the eastern sea. Men with pale skin and hair on their faces had come ashore. They carried sticks that thundered and killed from a distance. They rode beasts like deer, but larger and without antlers. Makuma sent his artists to the coast. Draw everything, he told them. They sketched the ships with their cloth blankets hung from poles. They captured the metal clothing, fattened away obsidian blades. They drew dogs, enormous and fierce. Nothing like the small, hairless dogs the Aztecs raised for meat. Among the strangers was a woman who spoke natal Dut. Her name was Mullins, though the Spanish would call her Meline. She had been born to a noble family in Coatzacoalcos, sold into slavery after her father died, passed from owner to owner until she ended up with Theshantalmaya on the coast. The Chantal had given her 2 strangers, along with 19 other women after losing a battle. It was standard practice. Women as tribute, women as peace offerings, women as servants. But Malinda did something the Chantal did not. These strangers were different from many conquerors who had come before. She learned their intentions through Ganathor. Captive, a Spaniard named Dagalar, who had lived among the Maya for 8 years. He spoke Mayan, she spoke Mayan and Natal. Together they could bridge 3 languages. Through Thishian of translation, Malini discovered strangers sought gold and subjects for their distant king. More importantly, the strangers had weapons that could crack the Aztec Empire open like an egg. Her own people had been crushed by that empire. Her family scattered, her birthright stolen. These pale men offered something she had never imagined possible: revenge. The Spanish leader, Cortés, quickly grasped Malini's value. She knew the landscape, the politics, the tribute routes. She understood which cities had to Tenochtitlan and why. She could smell fear and opportunity in equal measure. Within weeks, she had become so central to negotiations that indigenous people began calling Cortés himself Millennia, recognizing her as the true voice of Spanish power. Moctezuma studied the drawings his artists brought back. The strangers had defeated the Tabascans easily. They were moving up the coast, asking questions about Tenochtitlan. They seemed particularly interested in gold. He sent them presents, gold discs, size of wagon wheels, hoping wealth would make them leave. It had the opposite effect. The Spanish saw the gold and pushed inland, maliniguid them toward Tlaxcala, enemies of the Aztecs who might serve as allies. She was building a coalition piece by piece, city by city. In Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma's advisors argued through the night. Some said, "Kill the Chisno." While they were few, others counseled patience. Learn their intentions, discover their weaknesses. Moctezuma chose to wait and watch. It would prove the worst decision of his life. Chapter 6. The God of Whispers and Lies. Moctezuma did not think Cortés was a god. This story, repeated in countless histories, was invented decades later by Spanish friars who needed to explain how 500 men toppled an empire. The Emperor Wo commanded a 100,000 warriors, did not mistake unwashed soldiers for Devonbing. The myth first appeared in 1552.30 years after the conquest. Franciscan friars wrote that the Aztec Shad welcomed Cortés as Quetzalcoatl returning from the east. It made a satisfying story. The pagans recognizing Christian destiny, divine providence, conquering devil worship, none of it was true. Cortés himself never claimed to be taken for a god. His letters to the Spanish king describe suspicious locals, tense negotiations, constant danger. He wrote about gold and political alliances, not about Tift. The men who were there, Spanish and indigenous alike, told of warfare and disease, not prophecy. The real Moctezuma was no mysticalized by fate. His spy networked the Spanish from the moment they landed. His messengers reported every battle, every alliance, every word Malini translated. He knew these were men, not gods. Men with superior weapons, but still men hobbled and died. The Florentine Codex, written by indigenous survivors, reveals Moctezuma's actual strategy. He sent gold to make them leave. When that failed, he sent food and guides to control their route. He invited them to Tenochtitlan, where he could contain them. Every choice was calculated, rational. Political, Moctezuma understood that even victory against the Spanish would cost thousands of lives. The thundersticks and metal clothing would exact a terrible price. Better to wait, better to learn their better to let disease or distance solve the problem. Other invaders had come before. They always left eventually. The Quetzalcoatl myth took root among later indigenous writers for different reasons. Faced with the trauma of their world's destruction, some found comfort in prophecy. Their monsters had not been defeated by mortals. They had been deceived by destiny itself. It was easier than admitting they had simply been outmaneuvered. A young indigenous noble writing in 1570 put it plainly. If our grandfathers belled these men were gods, then they were not fools for losing. They were a tragic heroes caught in a cosmic drama. This was the story that saved dignity from the ruins of empire. But dignity built on lies serves no one. The Spanish won through smallpox and steel, through indigenous allies who hated Aztec rule, through Malenka's brilliant manipulation of old grievances. They won because Moctezuma waited too long to fight, believing Heckled managed the threat like he had managed everything else. The truth was both simpler and more terrible than any prophecy. The Aztecs lost because they faced weapons they had never seen, diseases they had never encountered, and enemies who broke every rule of warfare they knew. They lost Asherman's lose through miscalculation and misfortune. The gods had nothing to do with it. Chapter 7. The Night of Sorrow. The Spanish had been in Tenochtitlan for 8 months when Pedro de Alvarado destroyed everything. Cortés had left for the coast to fight other Spaniard who wanted to arrest him. Alvarado stayed behind with 80 men. In May of 1520, during the festival of Tenochtitlan, he made his move. The Aztec nobles had gathered in the temple courtyard to dance for their gods. They wore their finest feathers, their gold lip plugs, their jade ear spools. The singing was like the noise of waves breaking against rocks. Then the Spanish sealed the exits. A survivor remembered what happened next. The Spanish came out equipped for battle. They stationed themselves 80 trees, place where people went in and out. No one could leave anymore. When anyone tried to go out at the entryways, they struck and stabbed him. The Spanish killed everyone in the courtyard. They cut off arms wearing gold bracelets. They split heads to take jeweled headbands. The blood of warriors ran like water. Bodies piled so high that those trying to escape climbed over corpses, only Tomit Spanish swords at the top. The city exploded. Within hours, thousands of warriors round the palace where the Spanish had fortified themselves. They brought logs to ram the gates. They hurled stones from slings. They shot arrows that darkened the noon sky. The Spanish had superior weapons, but they were trapped, outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Moctezuma tried to calm his people from Thalos roof. A stone struck his. He died 3 days later. Whether from the wound or Spanish swords remains disputed. His brother quickly took command. He was a warrior, not a diplomat. He ordered the bridges removed from the causeways. He had weapons distributed to every household. Cortés returned to find disaster. His indigenous allies from Tlaxcala were dying of starvation in the palace. The Spanish were drinking their own urine. They had melted down Aztec gold into portable bars, but had no way to escape with it. Every attempt to leave their palace met waves of warriors who seemed to pour from the stones themselves. On the night of June 30th, they tried Taznek out under cover of darkness and drain. The Aztecs were waiting. War canoes filled the canals on both sides of the causeway. Warriors attacked from the water while others pressed from behind. The Spanish built a portable bridge to cross the gaps, but it got stuck under the weight of men and gold. The canal was completely full of them, a survivor wrote, full to the very top. Those who came last just passed and crossed over on people. On bow days, Spanish soldiers drowned, pulled down by gold-filled pockets. Plaques on alleys were pushed into the water by the press-off fleeing men. Horses screamed as obsidian blades severed their legs. Of the 1,300 Spanish and 6,000 indigenouslies who tried to escape, fewer than 400 survived. They lost all the gold, all the cannons, all but 23 horses. Cortés wept at the base of a neuter tree, watching his conquest disappear into the lake. The Aztecs called it the Night of Sorrow. They had Chapter 8, the Silent Killer. The Spanish limped back to Tlaxcala, fewer than 400 survivors. They expected to find refuge. Instead, they found a city dying. A disease had arrived with a Spanish slave from Cuba spreading through the population like fire, through dry grass. Bodies covered in pestles, children crying beside dead parents. The smell of rotting flesh in every street. Smallpox had reached Mexico. The indigenous people had no word for it, no treatment, no immunity. They called it Great Rash. It killed 3 out of every 10 people it touched. Sometimes more, entire villages disappeared. Farms went untended. The tribute system that fed the empire began to collapse. In Tenochtitlan, the disease arrived with returning warriors. They had touched Spanish corpses, stripping them of weapons, and within days, the first pestule suffered. Within weeks, the city was overwhelmed. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be burned. The canals filled with corpses. A survivor described the horror many did from hunger. They could not get up to search for food. Many died on their rods. The sick were left on soiled sleeping mats. Those who recovered bore deep scars on their faces, their bodies, marks that would identify them forever as survivors of the plague year Tenochtitlan. The warrior emperor who had driven out Spanish ruled for 80 days. Thepustules appeared on his body in November. He died within a week. The council chose his nephew, Cuauhtémoc, barely 25 years old, to lead them through the catastrophe. While Tenochtitlan burned its dead, Cortés made a decision that would determine the war's outcome. He sent to the coast for more men and supplies. More importantly, he ordered the construction of 13 brigantines, ships that could sail on Lake Texaco if he could control the water. He could strangle the island city, the claques, Corins. Despite their own losses to disease, provided 8,000 workers. They cut timber in the mountains. They carried the pieces 50 miles to the lake. The Spanish taught them to forge nails, to weave sails. Tomic's pitch for waterproofing. It took 4 months to build the fleet. The Aztecs were not passive victims. They studied Spanish weapons with the systematic attention they had unsupplied to astronomy. A captured crasper was dissected, its mechanism understood. The crossbowmen aimed the bolt well, they noted. Their arrows missed nothing. They all hit someone, went all the way through someone. But understanding the weapons did not mean they could counter them. Steel's words cut through wooden shields. Cannons shattered walls built for booty, not bombardment. Horses moved faster than any warrior could run. And behind every Spanish advantage stood the real killer. The disease that had reduced Tenochtitlan by half. By spring of 1521, Cortés had assembled 30,000 indigenous cities that had paid tribute to Tenochtitlan for generations saw their chance for revenge. The Spanish provided the excuse, Thuapans, the leadership. Old hatred proved the soldiers. The final assault was about to begin. Chapter 10, The Price of Survival. Malini stood in the ruins of Tenochtitlan, planning her next move. She had helped destroy an empire. Now she needed to survive its aftermath. The Spanish soldiers who had praised her intelligence during the war looked at her differently in victory. She was forceful but dangerous. A woman who had betrayed one people might betray another. In 1524, Cortés announced an expedition to Honduras. The journey would cross jungles and swamps, taking 2 years if they survived at all. Malini understood this was not exploration, but exile. Cortés wanted to remove potential rivals from Mexico City. She would be traveling with men who no longer needed her. Before leaving, Malini arranged her own protection. She married Juan Jaramo, a Spanish lieutenant with good. The ceremony was quick, practical. This marriage gave her legal status as a Spanish lady. Her children would be legitimate. They could not be enslaved as a wedding gift. She demanded her birth village of Aluta as an encomienda. This grant gave her the right to collect tribute from her own people. The woman sold into slavery had returned as Darula. She would extract wealth from Theplis that had rejected her. Historians not record what her relatives thought. Another woman navigated different ruins. Teuj Pots. Moctezuma's daughter had served the siege. The smallpox feedeth of her city. The Spanish called her Isabel. She was 19 years old and had already buried 2 husbands. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, had been her third. Cortés had him hanged in Honduras for conspiracy. Cortés arranged Isabel's 4th marriage to Alonso de Grad. A Spanish conc is tad or dot as dowry. She received the encomienda of Lacopan, making her one of the wealthiest women in New Spain. When Grado died of illness, Cortés took Isabel into his own household. She bore him a daughter. Leonor, the child, was taken from Isabel immediately. Spanish custom demanded that mestizo children of noble fathers be raised in proper Spanish households. Isabel would not raise her own daughter. She would barely see her. This was the price of survival. Your wealth remained. Your children disappeared. Isabel married twice more, each marriage securing her position in colonial society. She learned Spanish, adopted Christianity, wore European dresses. In public, she was Isabel, Spanish noblewoman. In private, she taught her legitimate children, Noel. She told them who their grandfather had been. Mellini died in 1529, possibly of smallpox, possibly of something else. She was perhaps 27 years old. Her son, by Cortés Martin, would grow up to be a soldier. Her daughter, by Jerónimo María, would marry a Spanish merchant. Both would deny their indigenous blood one convenient. These women understood what the warrior shared not. The conquest was not just military defeat. It was the destruction of a world where their choices had meaning. They could collaborate or die. They could adapt or disappear. They chose survival, even when survival meant becoming someone unrecognizable. They chose a future, even when that future belonged to their conqueror children. Chapter 11. Forging a New World. In 1543, Don Alonso de Castaneda stood in a Mexico City courtroom, watching Spanish lawyers argue over land his family had held for 300 years. The documents they needed were painted on bark paper, in Jesuit words. The Spanish judge couldn't read them, neither could the Spanish. The case would be decided by people who understood nothing. Don Alonso came from Quangshan, a day's walk from the capital. His people had fought alongside the Spanish against the Aztecs. This alliance had earned them privileges, exemption from certain taxes, the right to govern themselves. But privileges meant nothing without proof. Spanish law required written evidence. After the trial, Don Alonso gathered the elders of his town. We need to create a history that the Spanish can read. He told them, not abandon our traditions, but translate them. Use their alphabeto, preserve our stories. Make documents they must respect because they exist in their language of law. The project took 3 years. Don Alonso brought together storytellers from different families, each holding pieces of their communal history. The rule had always been that truth was multiple. Each family remembered events differently. All versions were true because memory itself was truth. The Spanish could not understand this. They wanted single facts, clear dates, linear progression. Don Alonso's scribe had to translate complex histories for a new legal world. They drew from their people's tradition of linear year-by-year accounts which offered theories of cause and effect to explain how they arrived the present moment. They called their salt the Historia Chichime. The document mixed natal and Spanish pictures and words. It traced his people's migration from the north, their alliances and wars, their Every claim was supported by witness testimony, properly not or IZ. It was both ancient history and legal brief. In 1558, Franciscan priests ordered Don Alonso's village to relocate. The priests wanted indigenous people concentrated in larger towns, easier to convert and control. The villagers refused. They had their documents now. They had Spanish law on their side. The response was swift and brutal. Spanish soldiers burned every house in Quattinge. They destroyed the church the villagers had built with their own hands. They've scattered the people to different towns, breaking up families that had lived together since before the conquest. Don Alonso watched his life's work burn. The original documents survived only because he had made copies, hidden them with different families. He learned that law meant nothing when power disappeared, but he also learned that words on paper lasted longer than houses. He spent his final years teaching young men to write, not just Spanish and natal but Latin. The language of the church. He taught them to phrase their petitions in ways that Spanish officials would find compelling. He taught them that survival required mastering the conqueror's weapons, especially the ones made of ink. The historiochemia exists today in archives in Paris and Mexico City. Don Alonso's village was never rebuilt, but his great-grandchildren successfulized for the return of their lands, citing documents he had prepared for exactly that purpose. He had lost his world, but preserved its memory. Sometimes that was the only victory possible. Chapter 12. A glimmer of hope and a taste of fear. Don Martin Cortés arrived in Mexico City in 1563, carrying letters from the Spanish court. He was 40 years old. The son of Malin and Hernán Cortés, raised in Spain as apage to Prince Philip. The courtiers had called him the half-bred Indian. He had worn the insult like a The city of his birth had become unrecognizable. Spanish buildings rose where temples had stood. The canals were being filled with. The lake was shrinking, drained by Spanish engineers who feared flooding more than they understood balance. On live mountains remained unchanged. Martin found himself caught between worlds. The Spanish settlers saw him a son of them, almost. He had the name, the education, the royal connections. The indigenous people saw his face, his mother's cheekbones, and wondered if Harry remembered who he was. He spoke no now. This was both protection and loss. In July 1564, the indigenous districts erupted. New tribute demands from the crown had pushed people past endurance. They gathered in the thousands outside the indigenous government building. The Tecpan women led the charge, shouting their children were starving while officials grew fat. A witness recorded the scene. They insulted the governor himself. Pedro Masqui tried to separate people with his staff of office. They grabbed it from him and were going to kill him. They pulled his shirt off. Juan Caro took Alpha's sword so they would let him go. Otherwise, he would have died at Theobald's hands. As Chief Constable, Martin was sent to restore order. He stood before the crowd with an interpreter, unable to speak directly to his mother's people. Hepremized investigations, reforms, justice. The crowd dispersed. Unconvinced, they had heard Spanish promises before. The Spanish elite watched these events with growing paranoia. If the indigenous people could riot over taxes, what else might they do? Rumors spread of secret meetings, of weapons buying stockpiled, of indigenous nobles planning rebellion with mestizo allies. Martin's half-brother, the other Martin Cortés, made things worse. Born to Cortés's Spanish wife, he was Marquis of the Valley of Oaxaca. He walked through Mexico City like he owned it, which technically he partially did. He held parties where Spanish nobles complained openly about crown policies. He spoke of the old days when conquistadors ruled without interference. The Viceroy, Luis de Velasco, had kept these tensions in check for years. When Hay died suddenly in July 1564, the careful balance collapsed. Spanish fought Spanish over who would. Indigenous communities pressed for reform. Mestigos, like Martin, found themselves bested by everyone. The authorities began making lists. Who could be trusted? Who might rebel? Where did loyalties really lie? They noted that Don Martin commanded respect from both Spanish and indigenous people. They noted his brothers in. They noted how many mestizos held positions of authority, spread through the city like field diseases. Spanish officials slept with weapons beside their beds. Indigenous nobles burnt, compromising documents. Everyone waited for something to break. In this atmosphere of suspicion and terror, even breathing felt like choosing sides. Chapter 13. An Uprising of the Conquered. The July heat in 1564 made the city stink. Dead dogs floated in the remaining. Sewage ran in open ditches, where clean water once flowed. Into this pressure cooker, the crown dropped a new tribute tax on the indigenous population. Every adult would pay more. Every family would suffer. The explosion came within days. The crowd gathered before dawn at Aztec Pan, the indigenous government building. Women arrived first, carrying children and corn grinding stones. They set up their mates on the steps, grinding corn in unison. The sound was rhythmic, menacing. This was how they prepared food for their families. This was what they could no longer afford to do. By noon, 3,000 people packed the square. They had come from Tlaxcala, Saximilo, and the surrounding districts. Many were recently conquered people who already paid heavy tributes. The new tax would destroy them. They had nothing left to lose. Don Luis Sipac, the indigenous governor, emerged to address the crowd. He was one of them. Theoretically, his grandfather had been Aztec nobility, but he wore Spanish clothes, collected Spanish taxes, enforced Spanish law. When he opened his mouth to speak, their crowd erupted. The historian Chimal Pahin recorded Wufapan next. There was raging ansa. They insulted the governor. Pedro Masuqui jumped in, separating people with his staff office. Suddenly they grabbed it. They ganged together to kill him. They pulled his shirt off. Just naked was how they left him. Juan Cano, the Spanish husband of Moctezuma's daughter, Isabel, tried to intervene. The crowd turned on him. He drew his sword to escape, otherwise he would have died at the people's hands. Everyone gathered on the rooftops. Some ran to hear what was happening. Others ran away. The women were the fiercest. They threw stones at the governor's windows. They called him a traitor, a Spanish lapdog, a man who had forgotten his people. They demanded to know how their children would eat. They asked if he would feed them from his own table. Spanish soldiers arrived within Thawa. They arrested 46 people, choosing carefully. Community leaders, the loudest voices, anyone who might against further resistance. The prisoners were dragged to the central plaza for public punishment. The whipping lasted 3 hours. Each prisoner received 50 lashes, their backs split open. Blood pooled in the dust. The crowd was forced to watch insolence. Spanish soldiers stood with loaded muskets, waiting for any sign of resistance. After the whipping, the prisoners were sold into indentured servitude. 7 years of labor to pay for their crime of protesting. Their families would starve without them. This too was part of the punishment. Break the community, breaking its providers. The Spanish authorities thought they had demonstrated strength, restored order, collected their taxes. But Chimalpahin noted something they missed. The crowd had not dispersed in fear. They had withdrawn in discipline. They had remembered every face, every name, every act of betrayal. Thoy-prizing was suppressed. The anger remained. Chapter 14. The Courage of Don Martin. The Spanish authorities arrested Don Martin Cortés in January 1566. Not the Marquis with his swagger but the other one, Malin. They came for him at dawn with soldiers and chains, charging him with conspiracy to overthrow Spanish rule. The accusation was absurd, and everyone knew it. Martin had spent his life proving his loyalty to Spain. He had served Prince Philip as a page. He had fought in Spanish wars. He had never even learned his mother's language. Bhutan, the climate of fear after the riots. Being mestizo was crime enough. They took him to the same rooms where the Inquisition questioned heretics. Throughs were stone, windowless, lit by torches that made shadows dance. The interrogators were professionals. They knew how to break men without leaving marks that would show in court. First came the rack. They tied his wrists and ankles to rollers that pulled in opposite directions. Each turn of the wheel stretched muscles and ligaments closer to tearing. The pain was precise, scientific. They asked him about meetings that never happened, plots that existed only in their fears. Martin gave them nothing. He had learned addendrance in the Spanish court where a half-breed Indian boy faced daily humiliation. He had learned silence from watching his mother navigate between worlds. Every nobleman they had tortured before him had confessed to something. Martin held. Next came the water torture. They tied him to a board, tilted his head back, stuffed cloth in his mouth. Then they poured water, jug after jug, create a sensation of drowning without death. Between sessions, they asked their questions. Who were his allies among the indigenous nobles? What had his brother promised them? I have told the truth, Martin whispered Edwin. They finally let him breathe. And in the holy name of God who suffered form, I will say nothing more from this moment until I die. They poured the water 2 more times before the judge decided it was useless. Other Spanish nobles had already broken. Alonso de Avila confessed to fantasize of independence. Gil Gonzalez admitted those seditious conversations. Their testimonies extracted created a web of conspiracy that existed mainly in their desperation to make the pain stop. But they could not break Martin. His mestizo blood, which they saw a sweetness, had given him strength they could not understand. He had lived his entire life, being neither Spanish nor indigenous, belonging nowhere completely. Spain was just another country where he did not belong. Word of his resistance spread through the city. Spanish nobles spoke of it in whispers. Indigenous workers passed the story in the markets. The son of Molina had faced Spanish justice and not Benton, a world where everyone eventually. His silence was revolution. They released him after 3 months, unable to prove anything because he had given them nothing. He walked from the prison in legs that would never fully heal. His shoulders would ache for the rest of his life. But he had won the only victory available to him. He had kept his Anorwan. They tried to take everything else. Chapter 15. A Defiant Legacy. Chimalpahin arrived in Mexico City in 1593, carrying nothing but his ability to read and write. He was 24 from the town of Calco, descended from minor nobility, who had lost everything in the conquest. The Franciscans gave him work, copying documents, in the church of San Antonio. He would spend the next 40 years recording a world disappearing before his eyes. The city had transformed again. The indigenous population, once 200,000, had shrunk to perhaps 30,000. Smallpox returned every decade, each outbreak taking more lives. The canals were gone, filled with rubble and waste where floating gardens once fed the city. Spanish wheat fields stretched to the horizon. The labor force was changing too. Ships arrived monthly from Africa, their holds packed with enslaved people. By 1600, the city held more Africans than indigenous people. Chimalpahin watched it them in the markets, heard their languages he could not understand, recognized in their eyes a loss he knew intimately. In 1612, fear swept through the Spanish community. Someone claimed to have overheard African workers planning rebellion. The authorities responded with they arrested 29 men and 7 women. Torturing them for confession may have been nothing more than desperate attempts to stop the pain. Chimalpahin watched the executions from the crowd. The condemned were hanged in groups, their bodies left swaying as he recorded every detail. The placement of the gallows, the prayers forced from dying lips, the faces of Spanish women who brought their children to watch. Then he did something extraordinary. He wrote down the names of all 14 Spanish officials who had ordered their full names, their titles, their responsibilities. Captain Diego de Avila, Judge Gaspar Dields, Prosecutor Juan de Salamanca. Everyone. This was not neutral record keeping. In NWAL tradition, naming carried power. To record someone's name in connection with injustice was to mark them before his story. Chimalpahin could not stop he could ensure they would not be forgotten. He could make certain the killers' names would be preserved amongst their crimes. He spent his evenings collecting stories from indigenous elders who remember the world before. Many could no longer read the old picture books. The oral traditions were fragmenting as communities scattered. Chimalpahin wrote everything down using the Roman alphabeto preserve no memories. He was joined in this work by Hernando Alvarado, Tezamuc Moctemusgretrans. Together they created a secret archive of indigenous history. They knew few people in their time would read these. That was not the point. The papers would still be there when people were ready to hear what the ancient Na themselves had to say about the world they once inhabited. Chimalpahin died in 1631, still copying documents in the Samcha. His manuscripts were scattered, some sent to Europe, others hidden in. They would not be properly studied for 300 years, but they survived. The names have preserved, both of the executed Africans and their Spanish killers, remain readable today. His defiance outlasted empire that tried to silence it. Epilogue: the echo of obsidian blades. The Aztec Empire lasted 200 years. The Spanish Empire replaced it lasted 300. Today, neither exists. But more than 1 million people still speak now, in the centuries after the conquest. A powerful sense of indigenous identity thrived, and a shared culture was. Forget-Fats celebrated their Aztec heritage. From the poetry of Juana Inés de la Cristo, the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe, today their descendants engage in political struggle and cultural renewal, writing new histories, plays and dictionaries in their ancestral language. What might have changed if the Aztecs had developed steel? If smallpox had not existed? If horses had survived in the Americas after the Ice Age? These questions misunderstand what happened. The conquest was not inevitable. It resulted from specific decisions, particular alliances, diseases that arrived at change any variable and history shifts entirely. Consider what the Aztecs achieved without draft animals, wheels for transport, or iron. They engineered a massive city on a lake with intricate canals and causeways. They created floating gardens, or China Persephone, immense fertility in the swampish. Their artisans were masters of feather work, sculpture, and painting, creating objects that stunned European observers with their beauty and intellectual subtlety. Most importantly, they did not see history as cyclical, but as a linear story of cause and effect, which they recorded in detailed year annals called the Sup-Ouali. The foods they cultivated filled vast city markets, which offered an astonishing variety of goods. Styler sold every type of corn, bean, and chili alongside turkeys, venison, fruits, and fish eggs. Their most prized crop, wasquisao, which they prepared as a frothaspous chocolate. Drink served to royalty in painted gourds. Their medical knowledge was based on Eric herbal tradition. Healers, both men and women, operated out of the markets, selling remedies for dozens of common ailments like fevers, headaches, and skin sores. The conquest destroyed more than it eliminated one of humanity's silent experiments in civilization. The Aztecs developed writing, astronomy, urban planning, and statecraft with no connection to old world traditions. They proved that human genius follows multiple paths. Their destruction aired our understanding of what Sochi could be. Today, Mexico City sits where Tenochtitlan stood. 21 million people live there, making it the largest metropolitan area in the Western Hemisphere. It still floods during heavy rains because the Spanish destroyed the Aztec drainage system. The city still sinks because its Spanish drained the lakes that supported it. Environmental problems the Aztecs solved 500 years ago. Plague Thimadorn capital. The Aztec legacy is not just in museum sand ruins, though those matter. It serves in the language spoken by Morathon, a million people, and in the political identity of modern Mexico. It lives in the determination of their descendants to preserve their history and imagine a new future under what some poets call the sixth sun. They provided human creativity has no cyclical expression. Their greatest gift was demonstrating that the world we know is not the only world possible. In their memory lies permission to imagine.